Hello everyone and welcome to our video lecture for this week. This week we're going to be talking about accountability, and as you talk about accountability when it comes to diversity, there are several things that we have to consider, and we're going to go through several of those things. We're also of course going to talk about the connection to the hat paper that you're writing for this semester, so let's get right into it. So the first thing we always start out with is thinking about what accountability really is. So in each of these process steps, we talk about what it is that we're talking about, right? We have to kind of get a level playing field, so to speak. So let's talk about what it means, what accountability means in our context. So accountability entails really sort of three levels, if you will, around what we're doing and how we're measuring it in organizations. And when I say three levels, I mean sort of three generic levels. I think you'll sort of understand as I go through this. So the first level is personal responsibility, right? So this speaks to issues of what am I doing? What am I contributing? How am I playing a part in this organization? And how am I holding myself accountable in terms of achieving goals and being sensitive to diversity needs and things like that? So there's that personal level, right? That individual level. So we move up and we say, okay, what is the organization doing? What are the organizational actions and goals? How are they being held responsible? What are they doing to move diversity forward within the organization, right? So when we say what's the organization doing, we're really talking about the collective actions of individuals, right? So it's not to say that the organization does one thing separate from individuals, although in a sense they do, right? So at the same time, organizations are made up of individuals, which is why we have to think about everything in between those two steps. So you go from the personal level, the individual level, we go to the organizational level, which in an organization, that's sort of the highest level you can get to, right? The larger collective whole. And then there's everything in between. You have teams, you have departments, work groups, committees, anything that entails more than one person, but not necessarily the entire organization, right? So three sort of broad areas when we think about accountability, and accountability can be measured at every level, every step of the way, or in most organizations, some organizations, let me say, it's not, right? So it's a kind of a messy hodgepodge of how things are done and how they're measured. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of this issue of the individual level versus the organizational level, the collective level. So I contend that there's an inherent tension between what we're accountable for, so collectively, and what I'm accountable for as an individual, right? So when I say tension, that's not necessarily a bad thing. What I'm saying is that we might have individual goals, we might have organizational goals or collective goals. Sometimes, and ideally, those line up, right? So what I am setting out to do as an individual lines up with what we are setting out to do as a group. But sometimes those don't necessarily line up. And even when they do, we sort of have to keep in mind that our individual goals have to be guided by the collective, if that makes sense. So there's this tension that plays out between these different levels of accountability, these different levels of responsibility. So let's talk a bit more about what accountability actually means. And this is according to Kennedy. She sets out four things that really entail accountability. Now, some of you may define accountability a bit differently, and that's okay. For this, we're going to try to come to some common understanding around what this means. So we talk about setting goals, measuring progress, mitigating pitfalls, and celebrating success. And we're going to go into these in a little bit more detail, not a lot more detail now. So let's talk about setting goals. In previous modules, we talked about the difference between proximal versus distal goals. So we talk about short-term, which is proximal, and long-term, that's distal goals. But that's one of the first steps in setting accountability, right? We have to have something that we're striving for. Otherwise, how do we know what to be held responsible for if we don't have a goal, right? If we don't have some measure of saying, this is how I'm going to define success, this is what I'm striving for, right? The second thing is measuring progress. And what's the most important piece about measuring progress is using data to support your position. And I would say that it's not just using data, but it's using good data, okay? And data can come in any form, right? You can talk about how people are reacting. You can talk about things, hard numbers like turnover and revenue and things like that. But you can also talk about how people feel and how people are thinking and how people are acting and those kinds of things. But the important part is to use data to support that position. Again, when it comes to diversity, those can be myriad of data points that we might look at, but it's important to use that data to say, look, we are measuring progress, we're making forward momentum, or we're not, and we need to correct where we're going. The next thing is mitigating pitfalls, and when I think about mitigating pitfalls, I think about the internal pitfalls versus the external pitfalls, and there's both, right? Any time you are striving for something new, if you're trying to get towards something, there's going to be pitfalls along the way. Some of those are things that you can control. Some of them are things that you cannot control. So internally, we think about things like politics, like resistance to change, like interpersonal dynamics and intergroup dynamics and things like that. It's just the human condition, right? It's people working together, and there's always some difficulties. There's always some challenges when doing that. Externally, we think about things like government regulation or the market environment. We think about things like stock prices and all those kinds of things that are maybe external to our organization that we don't have a lot of control over, but yet we still have to deal with, right? We still have to deal with all kinds of things that may come our way, okay? And it's important to mitigate those. It's important to try to address them if we can, and if not, we try to look at the progress we're making and say, how can we still make progress even if this roadblock is in our way? And lastly is celebrating success. And there's a positive approach. Many of you are probably familiar with this idea of appreciative inquiry, which says that we need to look at the positives of our organization and we need to focus on those rather than our shortfalls, right? We need to focus on those because that will help us get forward more quickly than focusing on what's going wrong. So celebrating those successes. I would also add to this, though, that we also in some way need to celebrate our failures. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but if we have a culture where we can say, look, failure is okay. It's okay to say, this didn't quite work out, but we learned from it. This didn't really go the way we wanted it to go, but we learned from it and we chose something new. I think that's okay. Now, some people will say, and this is true, that we don't necessarily have time to fail. We don't necessarily have the resources to fail. We can't just pour a bunch of money into failing kinds of things, failing kinds of initiatives. And I agree with that. And I think that that is an important consideration to make. But at the same time, if you're not allowed to fail, you're not going to take risks. Okay? So I think there's a balance to that for sure. Let me pose a couple of questions to you in terms of accountability, just to get you thinking around this idea. So Kennedy contends that it's interesting how we so easily shy away from the notion of personal responsibility, right? If we say, hey, who's going to take responsibility for this? Who's going to be accountable for this? It's really easy to say, oh, not me. Or maybe somebody else needs to do that. It's so easy to do that. It's also easy to say, when something fails, you know what? It wasn't my fault. It was the organization's fault. It was our competitor's fault. It was Bob's fault down the hallway. It was Karen's fault in HR. It was someone else's fault, right? It's really easy for us to do that, and we kind of slip into that almost naturally, right? To say, you know what, it's not really my thing. Now, I think great leaders are able to say, you know what, I'll take responsibility for this. This is my doing. I'll take I'll shoulder the responsibility for either moving goals forward, or maybe it's a failure, or maybe something didn't go right, things like that. So I would ask you rhetorically, do you agree with this? Do you agree that it's easy for us to sort of shy away from personal responsibility, not only in our organizations, but also in life? And what are your thoughts about the argument she makes? Do you think it's, if you agree, why would you agree? If you disagree, why would you disagree? What are some examples? What would you add to it? How might you change what she's saying here? And lastly, how do you, your peers, your colleagues stack up when it comes to holding personal responsibility as a core value? Do you feel like you really do? Do you feel like you really have personal responsibility as a core personal value? What about your colleagues? What about your organization? Is it woven into the culture of your organization? So think about those things as you're riding your hat. So let's get into the connection to the hat specifically. Now in the accountability portion, this is again from the syllabus, it says, now that you've considered some specific diversity goals for the organization, which is what you did in the last section, think about who will be responsible for implementing those goals. In this section, in the accountability section, consider your own role in leadership capabilities, even if you're not directly involved in diversity initiatives. So many of us may be in separate parts of the organization. You may not be in HR. You may not be in any kind of role that you might have a direct influence on diversity initiatives, but think about your role anyway. What exactly should or can your role be in creating a more diverse and inclusive workplace? So think about that individual perspective. Okay, think about we talked earlier in this discussion about that individual level of responsibility. What should your role be in having this more diverse and inclusive workplace? Who else can or should be responsible for these types of initiatives, and how will accountability be upheld? Again, think about going back to those 4 things that we talked about today. How would you hold people accountable, hold the organization accountable in this regard, especially in regards of moving diversity forward and looking at those goals that you've set, looking at the action section that you wrote. Who's going to be doing those things? Who would you hold responsible, and what would be your role in doing those things? Okay, good luck writing this section. I know you'll do well.